Hello everybody, I want to discuss When They See Us on Netflix. This documentary was directed by Ava DuVernay. Now, the documentary discusses the case of the Central Park 5, the case where the 28-year-old woman Tris Mailey was raped in Central Park, New York. Five young boys who happened to be in the park at the same time as Miss Mailey were accused of her brutal rape. Now, the police department didn't have any evidence on these young boys, but yet they were hauled in not as witnesses, but as suspects. Now, the New York Times labeled this case the Central Park 5. And the reason why they did this is because they wanted to dehumanize these young boys. I hate that title, and I'm not going to refer to them as the Central Park 5. I want people to know them as who they were. They were young kids. They had names. They were human. They were not monsters. They were not thugs. They were not criminals. They were not rapists. Let's get to know who these kids were. I'm going to call them by their names. Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Kari Wise, Yusef Salam. This is who they were. They were not faceless. They weren't voiceless. They're not animals. They are people. They are kids who had families. They are kids who had a future. And that future was stripped from them by a crooked prosecutor, a crooked police department. Linda Fairstein, the head of the sex crime division of the New York Police Department at that time, wanted a conviction at all costs. She did not care if these boys were innocent. It didn't matter to her as long as she got a conviction. And she used her police officers to beat and coerce a confession out of these young boys. She had these police officers beat these boys in the interrogation room without their parents, which was illegal. Now, two of the boys were 14 years old, and I believe in the state of New York at that time, 16 was the legal age that they did not need the parents in the room to interrogate. And I think only one of the boys were 16 years old. Despite knowing this, the police department still did their interrogation, and they beat a confession out of these boys. Now, watching the first episode, it kind of took me back to 1989 because I was 15 years old at the time, so I can relate to these boys. I was 15 years old, not in New York, but in Los Angeles. And the crime rate was kind of the same with the LAPD. Now, despite the rape occurring in a completely different section of the park than the kids were, the police department still dragged these kids in. Mrs. Fairstein wanted a conviction, so they beat a confession out of these kids to present to the DA. Now, despite the lack of evidence in the case, that octoroon Elizabeth Lederer still tried the case. Now, the evidence showed that the DNA didn't match any of the five boys, that Miss Mailey's clothes had a lot of blood on it, but the kids, they had no blood on their clothing that the police collected. They were in the wrong part of the park. The time frame was off. There was more evidence to show that they were innocent than to show that they had anything to do with this. But all of this evidence to exonerate them was ignored in the courtroom and also ignored by the jury as we saw this case unfold. The only thing people listened to was the coerced testimony that the police had these boys say while they were in custody. Despite the fact that there was no physical evidence, it didn't matter. These people just saw these young black boys as guilty just merely because they were accused of it. Now, when they discovered, they meaning the police department and the DA discovered that The DNA did not match any of these boys. I don't see how the state allowed them to continue to pursue this case. This case should have been kicked out back in 1989. These boys shouldn't have had to go to prison and had to fight for their freedom and had to fight to get their name cleared. Now, Ava DuVernay did an excellent job with this documentary. The actors were on point. The cinematography was phenomenal. It made us feel like we were back in 1989 and actually viewing this case for the very first time. And when I seen these boys being beaten by these cops, I mean, I felt their pain. I actually really felt their pain. And we have some naysayers out here about this documentary because what this documentary does, it humanizes these boys who became men in prison because they lost 10 years of their life. 10 years of their lives. You can never get that back. There's no amount of money that can give you 10 years of life. Now, although these boys got a settlement of $40 million, which is peanuts because they had to split that $40 million between the 5 of them, which is nothing, about $8 million apiece. The city owed them, and they still owe them a debt, in my mind. They still owe them. That was not enough. Now, Linda Fairstein should be in prison for what she's done. She lied to the judge, lied to the jury, they tampered with evidence, they coerced and physically abused these children. They were talking to the children without a lawyer and without their parents. These are all felonies. She should not be above the law. I don't care if she's 70 years old. I don't care about some organization she got kicked out of. That's not enough. She needs to be in prison. She should be paying for what she did to these boys. She should be paying for ruining these boys' lives. She gets to go on with her life like as if nothing happened. That Octoroon Elizabeth Lederer needs to be in prison. She prosecuted the case knowing that there was no evidence against these kids, knowing that the police department tampered with evidence and still went ahead and prosecuted this case anyway. She needs to be in prison. She should be behind bars. Those police officers who all participated in coercing, beating, and making these kids perjure themselves, they should all be in prison. These guys are getting the benefit of retirement on the city's dollar. These guys got their pensions. They went on with their lives as if nothing happened. This is all wrong. Where is the justice system? Why aren't more people upset with this? The perversion of the justice system. They misused their badge. They misused their positions. They took an oath. They're supposed to be about truth and justice. There was no truth or justice in this. It took these kids a decade later to clear their names. There's no way they can get that back. What they took from these young boys, what the New York Police Department, the prosecutor, the DA's office took from these young boys, they can never get back. And I'm surprised more people are not outraged by this. They're calling them criminals still. Some people out here are still calling these boys, well, these men now, criminals, saying that they were not innocent. Of course they were innocent. If you guys haven't seen this documentary, I suggest you see it. I mean, for those of us who understand what these kids went through, and I can definitely identify with them being a young teen in that era and in the way things were, even though it's not much different now. But I have to say it probably was a little bit worse then. But if you haven't seen this documentary, please do. And once again, this is Eddie Enigma. You've been Enigma-fied, and peace. Innocent until proven guilty. How about trying that?